My name is Noam Pianko. I am the Samuel Stroum Professor of Jewish Studies here in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And I'm really delighted to be welcoming you to this very timely Zoom conversation. This is particularly exciting because the Stroum Center and the University of Washington has really developed a tremendous strength in Israel studies over the last several decades, really, and it's only grown. And this is a wonderful testament to that, as we have three generations of University of Washington scholars here, senior scholars, Joel Migdal and Alan Dowdy has become part of our community. Some of our newer scholars who have come in more recently, Leora Halpern, and then Khan Katzman, who we've trained. And we're also delighted that Andrea Arai is here, who's a treasured colleague here in the Jackson School and is a wonderful example of the ways in which specialists in Israel studies here also go way beyond the Stroum Center and those who came here directly to speak and comment about Israel. So we're delighted to have everybody here. I want to thank all of you because it is the generous support of community members, many of whom are in the audience today, who have made this event possible, especially our advisory board. I'm not sure if one of those leaders of our advisory board, Sunny Goretz, it's actually his birthday today. So Sunny, if you're in the audience, happy birthday to you. And we also need to thank our tremendous staff at the Stroum Center, who work every day to bring quality, thought-provoking, and academic programming to new audiences. And these professionals include Sarah Zades-Rosen, Kara Schoonmaker, Grace Elizabeth D., Lauren Ben-Susan, Brendan Goldman, and Jenny McCollum. Just a few quick words about the logistics of today's talk. In order to keep the focus on this presentation, the attendees of the Zoom webinar do not have video and microphone enabled. However, you will be able to ask questions, and you probably can already see on your Zoom screen that there is a question and answer box. So as soon as our speakers start speaking, you're welcome to start adding your questions into that box, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. But please put those in as soon as they come up for you. And the way that we will run today is that each panelist will present briefly, and after that, we'll have that audience question and answer. So I will, and each speaker will speak for 8 minutes, and I will be strict on time, so we have time for your questions at the end, and we plan to wrap up by about 12:15. Our first speaker today will be Professor Alan Dowdy. Alan Dowdy is an affiliate faculty member at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies and is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. In 2017, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award in Israel Studies by the Israel Institute and the Association for Israel Studies. And Alan will speak on the over-interpretation of this year's election results. Thank you,
Thank
Alan.
you, Noam. It's a pleasure to be invited to participate here as a visiting scholar. I really would like to be a part of this community, and I appreciate this opportunity. Don't have much time, so let's get into it. The basic question that I ask is whether this election represented a sharp turn in Israeli politics, as has generally been interpreted. This actually is two questions. One is, was there a significant shift in the electorate itself? And secondly, do the results of the election represent a shift? Now, the answer to the second question is definitely yes, and I'll leave it to the other panelists to spell that out. I'll be addressing the first question about whether there was a significant shift in the actual voting patterns of this election, and the answer is no. If you take the right and religious parties together, which generally act as a bloc, they received about 57% of the vote in this election, compared to 58.7, slightly more in the previous election. They did win 2 more seats. By my definition, I go from 72 seats before to 74, but this slight gain was really just a function of the fact that 2 left-wing lists missed the threshold, and the 8 seats that they might have won were redistributed to other parties. I'm including in the 74 for the right and religious, the faction of the National Unity party, which is under Gideon Sa'ar. The Likud itself actually declined from 24.2% in the last election to 23.4% this time. But again, they won 2 more seats than last time because of the left-wing collapse. Now, putting this all in perspective, in fact, the right and religious parties together as a bloc have been dominant since the turn of the century. So this does not represent a significant shift in the overall ideological pattern of the Knesset. Every election except one since the turn of the century, they've been dominant, winning 65 to 70 seats. And the only reason that they weren't able to form a stable government after the 4 elections in 3 years was, of course, because of the split in the right wing over whether to work with Bibi or not. So the real story of this election was the eclipse of the anti-Bibi elements on the right. The 4 right-wing and religious parties that support Bibi went from 42% to 48% of the vote. That's the biggest, most important result of this in terms of a change. 3 right-wing parties coalesced to form the religious Zionists, who went from 6 seats to 14. And this came basically at the expense of what had been the party of Naftali Bennett, which won 6.2% of the vote in the previous election, but was wiped out in this election. That 5% of the electorate, which had voted for anti-Bibi parties on the right, went largely, obviously, to the religious Zionists, and explains the difference in the outcome as far as seats are concerned. So while there has been no profound shift ideologically, the election results do have the potential to bring about profound transformations in Israeli politics and society, and I'm sure others will spell that out. I would just point out that you have a government coalition of 64, and fully half, 32 of the 64, now are the representatives of religious parties. So this has, I think, some very deep implications for Israeli society. Let me just end with some comments on the collapse of the left, the left-wing collapse, which was the factor that enabled the Netanyahu bloc, which won only 48% of the vote, nevertheless to come out with 64 of the 120 seats, because Meretz on the left and the Balad party and the Nationalist Arab Party both narrowly failed to meet the minimum threshold for representation. And so it was the disunity of the left as much as anything that produced such a profound result. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Dowdy. We are now going to move to Professor
Alan, please.
I'm a big formal here, give me the respect of being in this esteemed group. Thank you, Alan. We're now going to turn to Professor Joel Migdal, who is the professor emeritus here at the University of Washington, the Jackson School. He held the Robert F. Phillips Professorship of International Studies at the University of Washington, and he will present on various parties' attempts to run joint lists and the challenge of coalition building for Bibi Netanyahu.
Thanks, Noam, and it's good to see, or at least know, that everybody's on board. So many people that I know. For the last 6 years or so, the single most important factor in shaping Israeli politics has been the corruption scandal surrounding Netanyahu. And this was as true in last month's election as in the previous 4 elections. Netanyahu's challenge has been to put together a majority coalition that could pass legislation to cancel his trial and rein in the judiciary. And this is first and foremost in his mind and what he wants from his coalition partners. As he tried to put together a bloc that would succeed in getting the more than 60 votes, 60 seats, he faced a kind of catch-22 leading up to the election. He needed these partners for the coalition, and he needed ones that were specifically committed to canceling his trial. So he banged heads to get the two major religious nationalist parties of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich to unite for the vote, and they got a third party in there too, a very small party called Noam. And he feared that if these parties ran separately, each of them would fall below the threshold, which is you need 3.25% of the vote to get into the Knesset, and that they would, therefore he wouldn't have the block he needed. So he pushed this unification of these religious nationalist parties, and he's excellent at this sort of maneuvering outside his own party to get other parties to operate in the way that he wants. But as the election went on, and here's the catch-22, the United Religious Nationalists were gaining, and Netanyahu saw them actually taking votes away from his Likud. In the initial polls, the Likud was getting about 39 seats, 38, 39, and in the final vote, they got 32. And so he saw this religious bloc really looming large and being more powerful than he hoped it would be. So they then could have leverage in demanding strong ministries, and I'll come back to that later. The opposition leader, Lapid, faced the same catch-22. He needed the leftist parties, Meretz and Labor, to unite to make a strong center-left bloc that would support him. And he needed two of the three Arab parties to unite. Even if they would not join him in an eventual coalition, he felt they could block Netanyahu from gaining a majority. Unlike Netanyahu, Lapid was not so skillful. He did not bang heads. He seemed to content to increase the votes for his party without worrying about potential coalition partners. And Labor under Michaeli was really reluctant to merge with Meretz, and this was a big mistake for everyone. Both Meretz and the Arab party Balad did not make the cut, as Alan said, and that meant that as many as 8 seats in a very contested election were lost to the anti-Netanyahu bloc. So in the end, even though the popular vote was extremely close for the Netanyahu bloc and the Lapid bloc, the margin of difference was about 3,000 votes, almost nothing. Still, the right wing was able to establish a majority coalitions with 64 seats, with just a shade more of the popular vote. By the way, of those 64, only 8 are women coming into the Knesset. So in the aftermath of the election, which we're in now, Netanyahu has clearly had a very difficult time in piecing together a government. He missed his self-imposed deadline that the day that the new Knesset would be sworn in, which was 2 weeks ago, he would have a government ready to go. He did not. There was talk that yesterday, Wednesday, he was going to announce his new government. He did not. And part of the difficulty stems from what I mentioned earlier, the stance of these national religious parties and the ultra-Orthodox parties. He had to offer key positions to people he distrusts and literally despises. Itamar Ben-Gvir, whom I mentioned, who Netanyahu said not too long ago was unfit to be a minister, has apparently reached a deal to be Minister of National Security, heading the police, even though he is a person who has been indicted 57 times and has been in jail as well. Bezalel Smotrich, who has also been in jail, arrested for a plot to ignite thousands or hundreds of gallons of gasoline on a major highway in Tel Aviv in 2005. He was arrested for that. He's reportedly had agreed now to head the finance ministry, which was one of the key ministries in the government. And midway in the 4-year term, switched to the interior ministry with Aryeh Deri, who is from the Shas ultra-Orthodox party. In other words, these people who Netanyahu deeply distrusted, and in fact, Smotrich at one point called Netanyahu the liar, a liar, the son of a liar. And Netanyahu doesn't forget things like that, yet he's had to yield to him in order to put together the coalition he needs in order to cancel his trial. So this has left the stalwarts in the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, claiming that Netanyahu has left him crumbs, and therefore they have weak ministries or unimportant ministries, less important ministries. So we should see the announcement of a new government shortly. I think it'll be in a matter of days, but it's going to be one with a lot of unhappy people who dislike each other intensely, and they dislike each other's policy priorities. We could talk about those priorities if we want in the Q&A. So the government will succeed in canceling Netanyahu's trial. They're going to pass a bunch of very reactionary bills early on, but I doubt that this coalition will last more than half of its allotted term. So I'll stop there and take more in question and answer. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joel. We appreciate that great overview. And now we are going to drill down a little bit more into some of those religious parties and figures that you just mentioned with Dr. Khan Katzman, who received his Ph.D. in international studies from the University of Washington's Jackson School in 2021. And as you will hear, his research and expertise focuses on the religious Zionist movement in Israel. In order to understand the place of religion in public and private life. And as I mentioned to Hayim before we started, what he started several years ago as his dissertation project, which seemed like a little bit of a on the margins of Israeli society, has now come to the center, and his voice is more important than ever. Hayim.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Noam, for the introduction. It's great to be here. And I really see myself as part of the UW community, and it's great to come back and have a great discussion about Israeli politics with all of you. What I want to talk about is, like Noam mentioned, I am a researcher of religious Zionism in Israel. And what I want to talk about is what might seem as a great paradox in the result of these elections for the religious Zionists. And that is the fact that although the religious Zionist party has reached a record amount of seats, this is the largest amount of seats that the religious Zionist party has ever achieved in Israeli elections, many religious Zionists feel alienated from the party, and they feel like they do not have any political representation in the Israeli Knesset today. And that is because many religious Zionists believe that the religious Zionist party is actually an extreme nationalist, fundamentalist version of religious Zionism, and it does not represent them as religious Zionists. And this question is, this paradox is related to one of the most important questions in the research of religious Zionism. And that is, if you look at the religious Zionist party historically, you see that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it reached between 10 to 12 seats in the Knesset. And then after the 70s, it was never able to reach those numbers again. And now they reached 14 seats. So the question is, there are various reasons for why the religious Zionists were never able to reach 12 seats again since the 70s. One explanation is because of two smaller ultra right-wing parties that were established, Tkuma and Hatchia. But one of the main reasons that the religious Zionists were not able to reach that achievement again, despite the fact, by the way, that the birth rate among religious Zionists is higher than the average birth rate in Israeli society, is because many religious Zionists who are born to the religious Zionist community do not stay within the religious Zionist community. The statistics used to talk about 1 out of 4 religious Zionists who is born to a religious Zionist family and in their adult life they are not religious Zionists. And now the statistics are talking about 1 out of 2. That means 50% of people born to religious Zionist families are no longer religious Zionists in their adulthood. But what I want to say now is that this fact is actually related to the 14 seats that the religious Zionist party has achieved in these elections. And that is because I argue that the electorate that has been added to the voters of the religious Zionist society is actually those people who were born to religious Zionist families and are no longer religious, and they still voted to the religious Zionist party. And the reason that they voted to the religious Zionist party is because although they no longer identify with the religious element of the religious Zionism, they still identify with the nationalism of the religious Zionist society. And that is what was represented by Itamar Ben-Gvir from the Jewish Power faction in the religious Zionist party. Because when you look at Itamar Ben-Gvir, he happens to be religious, but from the way he speaks, it seems that his religion is just coincidental. Okay, what he is really about is having a strong arm against the Arabs. It's about settlement. It's about demolishing illegal houses, both in the West Bank and in the Negev. And that is what speaks to the nationalist sentiment of the people who were born in the religious Zionist society and are no longer religious. So what I think this election proves to us is that within the religious Zionist identity, we can see that now the nationalism is stronger than the religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayim, for that very nuanced presentation and way of thinking about that. It's a lot of new ideas there that I really appreciate and add a lot to this conversation. Just a quick reminder, the Q&A is open, and I'm glad that everybody is keeping to their time, so we should have plenty of time for questions. So please start adding your questions to the Q&A whenever you have them. We will turn now to my colleague, Professor Leora Halperin. Leora is a professor of international studies and history and holds a distinguished endowed chair in Jewish studies and serves as the director of the Israel Studies program. She recently published The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, which tells the story of Zionist settler memory in and around the private Jewish agricultural colonies established in late 19th century Ottoman Palestine. And Leora will present today on Palestinian inclusion in and exclusion from the Israeli electoral process.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Noam. I put up here a map. I find that it's often easier to visualize when we have a visual. Israel, of course, is the Jewish state. 80% of its population is Jewish. Most of its political parties are Jewish. And as we've begun to hear about, those parties and their voters represent a great diversity of Jews and Jewish opinions. But one thing that we haven't talked about yet on this panel is that Israel has a 20% minority of Palestinian citizens, also known as Arab Israelis. And I've indicated on this map areas of their particular concentration. And then there's another approximately 5 million Palestinians living under varying levels of Israeli either direct or indirect control in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. And you can see how those areas either are or are not visible or represented on this local election map. I'm not going to talk about this in this presentation, but we should also remember that there are some estimates say around 6 million additional Palestinians abroad who descend from those who used to live in British Mandate Palestine. And many of them are citizens of other countries, but not all. So, I think whenever we talk about the Israeli election, there's the elephant in the room, which we may or may not see or want to talk about, is the question of whether we need to talk about Palestinians, and if so, which Palestinians, and why or why not are they relevant to our discussion. So I think it's helpful to remember that just the diversity of individuals who fall under the category of Palestinians. So of the residents who lived in Mandate Palestine before 1948, some remained in what became Israel. Some were displaced to areas within what had been Palestine that came under Jordanian or Egyptian rule. Others were displaced to other countries. And of those who remained within Palestine but outside the boundaries of Israel, many, although not all of them, came under Israel's control in 1967. Somewhere around 300,000 actually left the West Bank at that time and moved mostly into Jordan. So the fate of any given Palestinian in 1948 depended on a whole variety of circumstances, a lot of which were quite random. Some left but managed to come back right after the war. Some stayed, but then for various reasons left. Some of them, just because of their geography, happened to move to Lebanon versus the West Bank, and this had implications come 67 for which came under Israeli rule. So, right, we're not talking about fundamentally distinct populations. We're talking about population that was one population that became fragmented within these different categories. And each of these groups, each of these sub-communities has totally different relationships to the election and different possibilities of participating in that system. And so some of the questions that we might or might not want to talk about, and I think some people want to talk about all of these or only talk about some of these, is, right, how do we think about citizens within the country's democratic system who, for a variety of reasons, are second-class citizens? How might we think about that in relation to a country like our own, where we have citizens who in various ways are second-class because of race or background? How do we think about those controlled by that system but not represented by that system? And how do we think about Jews in those territories who are in fact represented? Do we think of these stories as interwoven or separate, or some of them as interwoven, some of them as separate? These are the concentrations of Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens. You can see where they're located. Joel talked a bit about the merging and division of Arab parties. The high water mark was in 2015 when a joint Arab list of all of these parties combined got 13 seats and became the third largest. Joel mentioned how that coalition fractured, and one of those parties, Balad, actually fell below the threshold and didn't make it in, which overall dampened the representation of these parties. So that's the story, that's the electoral story for the Arab parties within Israel. Part of the system, but for various reasons, because of real internal differences, fractured and therefore not fully represented. There are very significant differences between these parties, right? If these were Jewish parties, they would absolutely not be part of the same list, but for strategic reasons, they have found opportunities to combine. So that's one discussion to have. How do we think about this category of citizens within the state? Then we have the 5 million Palestinians who are in the West Bank or Gaza. So the West Bank and Gaza are not separate countries, right? Even if there's a border fence around Gaza, and in some ways it appears that way, it's not in fact separate countries. Thanks to the Oslo process of the 1990s, in theory, those Palestinians are represented by the Palestinian Authority. And then after the 2007 split, theoretically those in Gaza by Hamas. But for various internal reasons, there have not been elections for more than 15 years. And there is not really a democratic process to participate in. And in practice, because these are not, in fact, sovereign countries, Israel is the only sovereign in the area. And I think the thing that we might want to talk about, if we were to talk about these populations, is the way in which these territories and populations are entangled with Israel's citizen populations in any number of ways. The economic links of workers moving back and forth, products moving back and forth, environmental linkages, and of course the presence of the Israeli military around the perimeter of Gaza and then in Area C of the West Bank is an important part of the story, right? These are not places that are fully out of sight, even if sometimes they're out of mind. So meanwhile, Jewish settlers within those territories do get to vote. And one might see that as sort of obvious. Well, of course they would vote, but this was not obvious since in Israel, extraterritorial citizens can't vote, right? Israelis in the US can't send in an absentee ballot. And in fact, it took some legislation in 1969 and 1970 to actually define these communities as living on Israeli land, even though Israel had not formally annexed the land. So we have these islands, and I think the reason I wanted to show slides is that you really see it on this map, these colored islands of Jewish settlement areas that are voting and therefore have a color in these elections. And you can see the section I chose south of Jerusalem has a variety of settlements and settlement blocks that voted overwhelmingly for the religious Zionist party, which Hayim talked about, which is a party with, especially in its Jewish power wing, some very hardline, even violent policy suggestions towards the very people who are living as the majority within that territory. And I think that that particular proximity of settlers who are voting in the system and then the Palestinians who are not part of that system is in Hebron. You can see that Hebron is light blue on the map, so it appears that Hebron has voted for the religious Zionist party. In practice, that blue represents the votes of just 700 or so Jewish settlers, or in fact fewer since children can't vote, living only in a small part of Hebron, 700 Jewish settlers among around 200,000 Palestinians. It's the only Palestinian city with Jewish settlers in the city, and there's some very specific, unique features. But I think it brings up kind of more than any other place this question of like what this map shows and doesn't show, right? What does it mean to say or to show via a map that Hebron voted for religious Zionism, right? When there's actually a very small population that's participating in that vote, but one that's in touch with, intertwined with, often in conflict with the much larger majority. So, I want to just close here by saying that I don't have great answers to this question of interwoven or separate realities. They're very clearly interwoven. Structurally, legally, electorally, they are separate, right? The system keeps them separate. It encourages us to think about these different Palestinian populations as distinct, which they are in important ways, but are also not in important ways. And so I'm not answering all those questions, but I want to pose those questions because if we don't ask them, they just sort of appear to be white spaces on the map. And so I wanted to, make sure we bring that topic to the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leora, for sharing that perspective on the historical context, political context for these elections and the role that Palestinian Israelis play in that. We are now going to have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Andrea Gevurtz Arai. Andrea is a lecturer at the Jackson School of International Studies, where she teaches courses on Japan and East Asia anthropology and society. She is part of a collaborative project and working on a special issue on the aesthetics of activism and anthropology of the possible. And in that, she is writing on the topic of the performative translocalities of standing together in Israel-Palestine. Her talk today derives from that research. And Andrea will discuss the joint Jewish-Arab political organizing, a group called Omdim B'Yachad. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Noam, and thanks to all the other panelists. I'm really learning a lot from this panel, so I really appreciate what I'm going to be talking about today, and I will try to keep time as other people have, is beginning research. So I want to be very clear about that. I'm just going to show this.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for one moment? Would it be possible to do full screen on your PowerPoint? That way, I think we'll be able to see it a little bit more clearly on our screens.
Yeah. You have to remind me how to do full. I'm really embarrassed how to do full screen.
Play from current slide.
Huh?
Play from current slide, the second button.
Current show, yeah, play from current slide. Yeah. Thank you. Just shows how much I need to fix up my PowerPoint skills. Okay, I'm gonna read a little bit, and I might end up reading fast, but this is part of a talk that I just recently gave at the anthropology meetings. So my remarks today focus on the Jewish and Arab Israeli socio-political movement standing together, Omdim B'Yachad, Nakif Mayan, or the Standing Together movement, as they now call themselves. The Standing Together movement is one of many working for change in the Israeli state and society today. I started joining their online lectures, discussions, podcasts, and following their media postings about their varied campaigns and events in the aftermath of the Balfour protests and Black Flags of 2020. I have been particularly interested in the different forms of the political they employ, their notions of refusal to reproduce the status quo, and as they say, refusing to be enemies, redefinition of security, bitachon, and emphasis on standing up and for a together. My interests gather around their prolific use of representational forms, some of which I'll show today, that the theorist Jacques Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. And as I'm quoting from him, politics revolves around what can be seen, felt, sensed. Political acts are encoded in the medial forms, feet moving on the street, images in news.
Andrea,
Yes.
Andrea, I'm sorry, could you slow down? We're actually not that short on time, and people are having a hard time following. Just slow down. You've got plenty of time.
Sure. Okay, I'm sorry. So I'm quoting from Jacques Rancière. Politics revolves around what can be seen, felt, and sensed. Political acts are encoded in medial forms, feet marching, moving on the street, images in news. Forms have force shaping people into subjects, constituting the contours of what is perceptible, sensible, and legible. Moreover, STMs, tactics, aesthetic strategies, and the relation they insist on between the socioeconomic and political appreciation of the performative and translocal resonate for me with my current fieldwork in Japan, where most of my ethnographic work has been for the last 20 years. So just to explain the translocal, I'm going to quote from another theorist, Susan Buck-Morris, who writes in her Revolution Today, a kind of neural interconnection where sparks leap between the local energies generated by people in public spaces worldwide, but remaining visible to each other is crucial, even if our issues as local ones are not the same. Movements are mimetic, she says, rather than instrumental. They make the experience visible to others for whom the horizon of the possible expands, which is to say that Omdim B'Yachad, like many movements, use this visuality and in very creative ways to get their message out, along with lots of verbal campaigns too. Okay, in the following, I describe one of the, and I will show something from one of the SDM's pre-election campaigns, provide an example of ongoing campaigns, and see if I can get to some of their after-election things. And I just need to move from the next slide. Okay, not to that one. Sorry, that one. Okay. SDM's philosophy is also informed by Dov Khanim and Danny Filk's 2019 book, Ma La'asot Akshav, where they write, and they're both members of the movement. Change is not only possible, but absolutely necessary. In Israel, the struggle is over ending the occupation and ending the neoliberalization that has added to socioeconomic crisis to a political one. In this book, we argue that these twin crises have resulted in many dangers, but also in possibilities. This is where collective action comes in. The dangers grow when we don't make real, make concrete, and act on the possibilities. So right before you, you have one of the, an example of one of their recent pre-election campaigns. These were signs that were posted on at bus stops and then later projected on buildings. So I'm just going to talk about them for a second. And these captions change daily. So this is one of them, Bayot Mishutafot, Memshala Mishutefet, shared problems and shared government, which is a very strong statement about what they're looking for. So these signs began with simple but provocative questions. This is one of the statements. There were many questions in the other signs, and they were this light purple, this background of purple and yellow was also significant because their key colors are dark purple and white. So the color palette here is really important too. So these began with simple but provocative questions. What does an Arab woman or man do at bus stops, at the supermarket, at the bank, health services when their train is canceled? These simple questions were intended to interrupt the complacency of some, emphasize experiences in common, and exemplify a sensibility of shared existence. These pop-up captions and signs placed strategically in advertisement spaces beckon the public in public spaces to think of the other standing next to them, in line, sharing realities of time, space, insufficient wages, rising cost of apartments, food, fuel, and daily experiences of violence. What began with yellow caption boxes on purple background at bus stops was followed by larger signs hung on and in some cases projected onto the sides of buildings. I have a comment here about why bus stops and things that many of you are familiar with public transportation in Israel, which is quite different from here. People over 75 now ride free. They're used by many, and of course they've also been locations of violence. So the other thing that I would like to get to, and I know my time is short, is there along with these signs and things, there was a petition that they circulated at these places, both written and online, and here's what it said. Politicians, get with it. We have shared common problems and need a shared government. We want to show you the strong connections between Jews and Arabs. We all have it bad here. We all have it hard here. I'm translating from the Hebrew. We all pay too much at the supermarket. We all are stuck in traffic jams. We both pray that the landlord won't raise the rent beyond what we can pay. We both fear for the future of this place, Hamakom Hazeh, about our security, and we pray together for peace. The situation isn't fate. For this shared reality of unending wars and cycle of violence, we both pay the price, Jews and Arabs. The current system works in favor of a small minority and condemns, fucks the rest of us. But why is it this way? It is this way because we swallow the lie that Jews and Arabs can't stand together for a better future. In place of a government of fear that does its best to persuade us that we have to fight group against group for crumbs, we need a shared government of Jews and Arabs, a government that addresses all of its citizens as equal, one that serves us all. So I'm not watching the chat, but I will look and see if I have any more time.
I have about another minute or so. Do you want to do this last minute big picture kind of things that you'd like us to take away from all the research that you've done? Or let me continue if that's helpful.
So I think just a second. Sorry. I think that I would like to show just a couple of other, if I can, signs. So this is another one of their campaigns. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. So this is one of their big campaigns. I mean, what's interesting, I think, about this group is that they are very interested in what we call obvious politics. They're also interested in social issues, and their main message is not only about security, but their main message is that one of the things that divides the population are these socioeconomic problems. And so their main campaign is to raise the minimum wage to 40 shekels an hour, which is approximately $12.50 from where it is now at 29, which is really not a living wage like we have in the United States. And then these are just some examples of some of their gatherings. I encourage people to go online to look. They also have part of an English website, but they're and yeah, there's just a lot. Sorry, there's just a lot more to say about what I think is so powerful about a group like this. Their creative representational strategies, but also their message of together, which I think is, as they say, lo lavad biyachad. We need to be united to make this change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and to all of our panelists. That was really a very broad presentation, and we saw lots of different perspectives. And we already have several questions, which I'm going to start reading momentarily, and some time to answer it, which is really nice. And I also want to encourage our listeners to add any questions additionally that they would like. The first question, which I think is probably pretty broadly applicable, and to whichever panelist would like to answer, maybe most specifically to Joel or Al's presentation, is the following. In the wake of the joint government, what, if anything, has Israel learned from that joint government experiment? What, if anything, did they accomplish? Can the pendulum swing back to that or not? And maybe you want to explain, is it clear what the joint government means in this case?
So should I start?
Sure, that'd be great, Joel. Thank you.
Okay, I'm thinking that, Pamela, that you're talking about the government that's just going out of power now, that's now led by Yair Lapid and was led for most of the time by Naftali Bennett. So I'm going to address it that way. You can tell me if I'm mistaking what you're thinking. That government was very interesting. It put together parties from the left, Meretz, all the way to the right, including Lieberman and Saar's parties. So you had a real wide kind of coalition put together. And what was interesting about it is, and here I sort of knocked Lapid in my remarks earlier, saying he didn't have political skills, but he was very good in putting this coalition together. And basically what he said to each of these parties is, look, there are fundamental differences among us. You have to drop your most important issues, like for the left, the occupation of the West Bank, and so on. You have to drop those issues, and there are many things we agree upon. And the reason they agree upon them is because most Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis, are social democrats when it goes to public policy. Neoliberalism, Hayim can address this a little bit too. Neoliberalism and the new conservatism that's represented in some of the new think tanks like Kohelet really hasn't caught on. People believe in a kind of social democratic national and domestic policy. And so that's what they did. And I thought that was very encouraging, but it's not sustainable. And it broke apart over silly issues like, should there chametz be allowed into Israeli hospitals on Pesach? Well, this is an issue of burning importance, but it basically split the coalition apart. So it wasn't sustainable, but it actually was quite an effective government in many ways in dealing with smaller issues, in dealing with funds for the Arab sector, in creating a budget which Israel hadn't had in years, which is very important to sustaining social welfare and other health and other dimensions. They had an agreement with the teachers. A lot of very important things happened, but it's not a model for the future.
Great. Thank you, Joel. Leora,
Can I add something?
Sure. I think Hayim and then Leora and then Al, if you want to add something as well, go in that order.
Okay, yeah. So Joel, I just want to add to what you said about why is a coalition split. I mean, it is true what you said, that it's split because of that chametz law and Pesach and everything. But the truth is that since the establishment of the government, and I think also Naftali Bennett, I think also wrote something in the New York Times about this a few days ago. So since the establishment of the government, there was a campaign, an organized campaign led by Netanyahu and the right wing, a campaign of fake news and disinformation, and also personal attacks on Knesset members that were part of this coalition. And Bibi saw them as weak members, and he thought that he could pressure them to leave the coalition. They were threatened, and people came to their house and protested out of their houses, and one of them was allegedly attacked in a gas station. So all of these things happened, and there was extraordinary pressure on lots of these members to leave the government. And it was clear that it was also a very small government. It was clear that sooner or later some of these people will break, and they did break. And in my opinion, they just looked for an excuse, and that is the excuse that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Leora?
Yeah, I think it's just really striking the way this election shows, in fact, the previous government, and then also this election shows the extent to which the divisions are really no longer, as they were in the 90s, about the peace process, right? So if you had looked at the results in the 90s, right, the left, defined by labor, which almost didn't make it in, was promoting that process. And then the Likud, the major opponent, was opposing that process. And now labor has shrunk. The other parties that really place the two-state negotiations central also got very few seats or didn't make it at all. And it's as though that issue has fallen off the table, which really is striking because, most of the folks here probably, remember just for years and years and years, Oslo was a thing to come back to revive, to try to get back on track. And now it's really not part of the discussion within Israeli politics. In fact, it's only the occupied territories and their future is really only on the horizon via the Religious Zionist Party, which is really thinking about those territories, but thinking about them in a very different way, thinking about incorporating them, thinking about ruling them, which I think is a very, very striking shift.
Any other panelists, Alan or Andrea, do you want to add anything?
Maybe just a little bit of footnote. I tried to say that the major shift electorally, to the extent there was any, was in fact on the secular right, where Naftali Bennett's party was the one party that more or less disappeared almost completely. And I would refer to Hayim's comments about the vote for religious Zionists. Obviously, many of the people who would be generally defined as secular right went to the Religious Zionist Party. That 5% that Naftali Bennett's party had obviously went for the most part to the Religious Zionists. So Joel is right. The chances of this being reconstructed sometime are pretty dismal because the entire thing that Bennett represented has more or less disappeared from the political landscape.
Could I add something?
Yeah.
It was a very good question, Pamela. Thank you. I want to add something to what Leora said, because I think, first of all, what we're seeing in Israel is very much what we're seeing in the United States. And that is a kind of division which is not about issues, but is about personal attacks and identity, much of what Hayim was referring to and what broke this apart. I want to say one other thing about the move away from seriously thinking about a solution for the occupied territories. One of the issues I think in this campaign, these elections, was the issue of violence. The growth of violence in Israel has been really remarkable over the last couple of years. First and foremost, and especially in the last 6 months or so, armed confrontations between Israelis and Palestinians, terror attacks, Israeli army killing Palestinians almost daily. But you also have Israeli soldier assaulted a Jewish protester. You have gang-related killings. You have that within the Arab community, a tremendous spike in violence, gender violence, car burnings, road rage, which was never an issue in Israel in terms of physical violence, has become an issue. And so a lot of people voted for in these elections, not so much on economic issues or what you might think as the kind of bread and butter issues, but on the issue of violence. And the issue of violence really leads them to kind of target the Palestinians as the problem, even though they're just part of this problem. And that moves people away from willingness to accept a kind of negotiated settlement, a peace process, or anything of that sort.
Thank you. Andrea, you're muted.
So I'd like to add something like that, but tentatively, because I think that Joel lives in Israel now, and everyone else has much more on the ground experience. Hayim is there, etc. So I'm just speaking from what this group that I'm talking about and their related groups, the groups that they're now joining, I think that's their message, that people are afraid and they're voting as they have in the United States along those lines. But perhaps that this is not my opinion, this is the opinion of this group, that maybe they misinterpret cause and effect. That's the message of their petition. So the redefinition of bitachon, of security, needs to be first. What really will secure you? Is the circle of violence, and we can see that in America, any place, does the circle of violence stop with more violence and division? And the answer is no. The question is, how do you prevent those kinds of divisions, the kind of polarization we have here? If there is really a 99% of the population, if we're really divided into 99% and 1%, then something is keeping that 99% from identifying with each other. Omdim B'Yachad is saying something similar in Israel about the creation of those divisions, and when they say we refuse to be enemies, it's a very, these are those kind of questions about how do you stop that? How do you rethink that relationship between cause and effect? But again, I would love to do the field work, looking forward to doing the field work behind this. So I have much more to say on the ground at that time.
Thank you, Andrea. This next question, I think, is directed toward Leora's presentation, although maybe others can chime in as well. And I'm going to slightly kind of rephrase this, the question. Wait, things are moving here. Okay. And it's a question about the number, which you can confirm if you raised it, but the questioner says that you mentioned that there are about 5 million Palestinians living outside of Israel, and a concern that number is one that is not empirical, but one that, how does one demonstrate that number? And is that a number that you would be confident about, or what are the source for that number? And I guess the broader question is, when you're working and thinking in such a politicized environment where there are so many different sources of data and perspectives, how do you as scholars think about reporting objectively and trying to use the information that's accessible in ways that are objective and you feel confident are empirical?
Yeah, so I see that the question suggested that I said that 5 million are refugees. I didn't say that. I said Palestinians living outside of Israel. Some of them have in fact enrolled in refugee status via the UN, which is its own story, right, of why the UN has enabled that definition to persist after generations. But many of them are citizens of other countries who are not registered as refugees. So I certainly was not intending to suggest that that is a count of refugees per se. There's some people have mixed parentage. What does it mean to have one Palestinian parent or others? And I really didn't even address that population as far as what their interests or desires are, because they're more fully outside of the electoral process. I try to be as precise as I can be about what I am, and I'm not saying in this case.
Great. Any other thoughts on that number of refugees?
Maybe just to back up Leora, I think she's absolutely right, both about the count of the refugees and about the Palestinians in other countries. This pretty well fits in with the numbers that I've come up with.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. Another questioner asks to press, particularly Joel, but others as well. Joel, you mentioned in your presentation that there could likely be some reactionary laws in the short term. Do you have any specifics that you can share about what you anticipate those might be? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. All right. I have, so here are some of the things that are being talked about. Number one, they want to have a simple majority of the Knesset able to override Supreme Court decisions, right? So this is they want to, number two, they want to legalize the separation of men and women at religious, cultural, and educational events. Number three, they want to legalize what are now illegal settlements. Number four, change the law of return. Under the current law, an individual with at least one Jewish grandparent is eligible to immigrate to Israel and receive automatic citizenship. They want to cancel that. Five, religious parties want control of the education ministry. So in their schools, students will not be forced to learn math, English, and science. Six, Ben Gvir in particular wants to deport Arabs not loyal to the state and strip them of their citizenship. And seven, a general weakening of the judiciary. So there are, I may be missing one or two, but this is what I've compiled. And these are pretty radical changes for Israeli democracy.
If I could add just something else to worry about, and that, because yesterday I happened to hear a presentation by Rob Malley on the Iranian talks and the lack of any real hope that those are going to lead anywhere, the demise of the agreement, and his assessment that Iran could have, within a matter of weeks, enough fissile material for their first bomb under the current situation without the agreement. And there's been news or a leak of information before that Netanyahu was at one point ready to launch a military attack on Iran and was turned away by the Israeli military, who are not too enthusiastic about the idea for obvious reasons. Israeli cities would come under heavy bombardment from estimated over 100,000 missiles that are targeted on Israeli cities. So just in case there isn't enough already to worry about, I thought I'd throw that in as well.
Just one thought, Joel, can you clarify what would the new law of return would based on halachic or Jewish legal status of a Jewish mother, or what would the changed law of return look like?
It hasn't been real clear, but they're trying to edge towards an understanding of. First of all, there's a move which I didn't mention to right now conversions by Reform and conservative rabbis in the United States are recognized in Israel to move away from that. But also the understanding of who is a Jew would be halachically based. But I'm not sure the legislation actually says that. So there's no real legislation drawn up yet. This is a lot of talk at this point.
Interesting.
My understanding is that we're going to move from one Jewish grandparent to one Jewish parent.
Interesting. It also symbolizes kind of a shift from the original kind of basis of that law in Nazi definitions of Jews and World War, to a more religious-based definition of who's a Jew. Let's see. Okay. Another question here is, why do you think the left and center and the Arab parties ignored the strong advice to merge so as to avoid elimination?
Well, if I can just take this one, I mean, they didn't ignore it. many of them were working really hard. And even until the very last minute, it seemed that the Arab parties would run together. Meretz was pushing for union with Labor, but Labor rejected that. I mean, there were a lot of voices that were calling for that kind of unity, but there were enough deal breakers, like when Balad pulled out, it fell apart, but not because there weren't efforts.
I'll just add a word to what Leora said. The Balad, the Arab party that withdrew from the joint agreement, the leader said, there is really no difference between a left and a right government, between Lapid and Netanyahu, and therefore there is really no reason to protect Lapid. I mean, in the end, it was the Arab parties which led to the downfall of the government. It was just as Hayim had described it. There were a lot of personal attacks and there were some withdrawals, but it really took the Arab parties voting for a motion of no confidence that brought down the government. And their reason then and their reason later for not reuniting was, what's the difference? Who gets elected? It doesn't really matter at all. I think a lot of their population really didn't feel that. And I think that's one reason Balad didn't get in. I think a lot of Israeli Arabs are very, very mixed about their reaction to these elections. They did note that the government had invested a lot in the Arab sector. Many of them are upwardly mobile. About 25% of doctors in Israel now are Arab, about 50% of pharmacists. You see them more in public spaces. And so they want to protect these gains that they've made. And I think they rejected the leadership's notion that there's no difference at all between left and right.
And I agree, Joel, with your analysis with regard to the Arab parties, and I think what was actually standing behind the split, because they were actually going to run together, Hadash and Balad, what was behind the split was the understanding that probably Hadash would support a government of Lapid and Balad would not, and that is that was the reason behind that. And with regard to the left wing, to the Jewish left, I think that it was just like a bad gamble. They thought that they were both going to pass. There are no big ideological differences between them. They just thought they will get more political power running separately. I mean, it was a catastrophic mistake.
Andrea, I think you're muted.
And I think it bears repeating that this is not that many votes, as Joel and Ellen were talking about, and Hayim too. This was just not that many votes and the threshold of 3.25, if it had been lowered a little bit, and I am not sure, but I heard a conversation among people that Lapid had been asked to do that and he could have done that. And if it had been lowered by even like a 1/10 of a percentage point, I think that's how much Balad missed, and the leader of Balad was talking about that. You would have had we're talking about 8 seats different, or at least 4, which would have seriously threatened. So I think while the picture, of course, I'm looking at something else. So while the picture looks gloomy to many people, I just want to remind everyone that our Congress here is hurriedly passing things like a Marriage Equality Act and an act to prevent a blocking of all mixed race marriages in the United States, because that's what the Republican Congress might do. And in that report from NPR about what might happen here, they answered that it's only because of the pressure of grassroots movements that this is happening at all. So I think of course I do. I think we should pay attention to the grassroots movements in Israel and how they're trying to link together what they're trying to do and their message, because that's where the pressure always comes. It comes differently. Sometimes it comes slowly, but the more people that join and know about them, I think along with the right, the better will be.
Right. I'm interested, as somebody who focused on the American Jewish community primarily, what do you think the impact might be of having I mean, Alan, you were saying it's in terms of total numbers, maybe things haven't changed so much, but in terms of some of the leadership, I mean, to have somebody like Ben Gvir, who is now in charge of security for the state, how might that impact the way in which American Jews think about Israel, or other countries around the world think about Israel? Are anybody in Israel talking about that, or your thoughts about that?
Well, I haven't been. I've been in Israel now for a full 2 months, so I'm not sure if I can talk about how Israelis are reacting. I noticed how Haaretz had an article about the new mood in Israel of not paying too much attention to what American Jews think or feel. I would predict, and this is no great act of wisdom. I mean, it's very clear that the Biden administration is going to have some problems dealing with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, particularly if they get into positions. Apparently, Smotrich is not going to be Minister of Defense, if the information so far is reliable. So at least they'll be spared that, but there will still be some frictions there. And we had the article by Dan Kurtzer and Aaron Miller recently saying that the U.S. administration should take a tough position on this. There's no reason to put up with this kind of nonsense.
I would just add that to what Alan's saying, for Israelis, there are a lot of essential issues which are in the offing now. For gays, for pluralism, for security, for Arab citizens of Israel. There are massive kinds of decisions. What the diaspora is thinking about Israel right now is very low on the list. There are a couple of articles in the Haaretz, as Alan mentioned, but this is not what people are thinking about right now.
But if I can jump in just regarding the American population, whose conversations in a lot of ways are just conversations, right? They only become actualized if they translate into some kind of policy, but those conversations are very real and very intense, as I think all of us know. Even before this particular election, there's growing polarization within American Jewish communities, and also honestly between Democrats and Republicans more generally over this issue, ending what had been decades of a very solid bipartisanship on this issue. More and more Democrats are speaking out more critically about Israel's policies and government, and I think that's only likely to increase with this new government. And that also means that there's more public presence for views that would have been seen as fringe or outside of the mainstream. And I think that that means that elements of the Jewish community that had been voicing concerns will probably feel more emboldened to continue to voice those concerns. But it also means that those who either support the new government or nonetheless feel that it needs to be defended will feel even more embattled. So I think this polarization that we've seen is only going to be further intensified by these results.
Thank you. Well, I want to be conscious of time here, and maybe I'll leave with just one last question, which is maybe a prediction. I think it was Joel, you had mentioned that you didn't think that this particular coalition would last very long due to some of the tensions within it. And there's a question about who in the coalition would pull out, or any predictions on that, of what might be the breaking point, the first breaking point that comes up, whether that has to do with matzah again and religious issues, or with questions about Arab Israelis or the West Bank, or what do you think? Any thoughts on where those might emerge first?
Who knows? I never would have predicted chametz on hospitals being a critical issue, and obviously it's just a straw that breaks the camel's back. But if I had to make a prediction, I would say that the defection is going to come within the Likud. not from the outside parties. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with Netanyahu. This has been growing very quietly because Likud was the biggest party last year too, and they weren't in the government, and they weren't in the government for one reason only, and that is there were anti-Netanyahu people. Had Netanyahu stepped down, all these Likud people would have had ministries and budgets and all sorts of things. And so there's been growing muttering. Now, the question is whether Netanyahu will keep that at bay and for how long. But if I were to predict, I would say the defections are going to come within the Likud.
I would.
I also. Oh, go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
Okay. I would agree with Joel. Those three other parties, they all have a stake in what they consider to be their major issues. Nationalism for the religious Zionists, and the two Haredi parties, God knows, they're not going to disagree over Hametz at all. So there still are secular people in the Likud, which is technically a secular party. And I heard some of the same things that Joel's been talking about, that in fact, not everybody in the Likud is, remember, Saar came from the Likud. He was one of the dissatisfied people within the party. So I would put my money on that together with Joel.
I actually I disagree, and I think that the Likud is really centered around the personality of Netanyahu, and that we can see that when Saar left the Likud, he was not actually able to get any voters with him. And if there will be another split, there's really not really. I don't really see any voters leaving the Likud and voting for this person who stabbed Netanyahu in the back. That would really not benefit them politically, doing something like that. What I think, first of all, I think this coalition is going to last. I don't know for how long, but at least, like Joel said, until these bills are going to be passed, and this might take a while. And after these bills are going to be passed, if I have to make a prediction, I would say either Bibi would dissolve the government himself after he gets what he wants and he is able to get his trial away, because I do not think he likes this government and he would prefer other partners. So once he's got the threat of his trial away, he might want to go to elections again and form a better coalition for him. And if that won't happen, I would assume that it will be the Jewish Power faction. Because what happens is that Netanyahu, almost in every coalition he made sure he has one party that is to the left from him. And he can always say, look, I want to make this right-wing policy, but these leftists or the Supreme Court, they're pulling me back and I can't really do what I want. And now he's got like the dream coalition for him to execute any right-wing policy he wants. But what I believe is he doesn't really want to execute that policy. And when that's going to happen, when Ben Gvir is going to start, I don't know even to imagine what he is going to do, but they're going to have tensions on who is more right-wing. Is Ben Gvir more right-wing than Netanyahu? And Ben Gvir needs to always show that he's the most right-wing person in the room. Then I think that might push him to leave the government sooner or later.
Well, I want to thank you all for being part of this conversation. It's wonderful to see the tremendous resources that we have here in the Stroum Center and the University of Washington more broadly, and how much that you all can contribute to this discussion of the changing politics in Israel. I also want to thank all of those in our audience who helped to support the Stroum Center. And now that it's the end of the year, it's a good time to think about whether or not you could be able to support what we do and make programs like this possible. And save the date for Ladino Day 2022, which is going to be this Sunday morning at 10 a.m. And that's always it's become such a central part of what we do here in the Stroum Center and in the Seattle community and really internationally. So I encourage you all to join us to discuss the future of Ladino. So with that, I wish you all a good day and thank you for joining us and thank you to our panelists. Bye-bye.